So the purpose of this video is just to give you an idea of what's going on with the program in our first Arduino activity. In this particular activity, we're actually going to get our code from one of the examples within Arduino. So you can see I have the Arduino Sketch window open, and I'm simply going to go to File, Examples, Basics, and you can see there's all sorts of different examples that you can use to get you started on different things. But we're going to go to Basics, and we're going to pick Blink. And the purpose of this code is to make an LED turn on for a second and then off for a second repeatedly. So I'm going to go line by line through this code and just explain what's going on. Okay, so first of all, you're going to see right here at the top we have a slash and then an asterisk. What this tells Arduino is that this is going to be a long comment. And we use these comments to describe what's going on with our code. And so with the long comment, this is going to be several lines we're trying to explain something. Then you'll see right below it, we have a single comment line that's just a double slash. So that's two ways to comment in Arduino. So let me come back to this one. We have a slash asterisk, and then we give the title of the code and explain what it is. Then to end our long comment, we do the opposite. We do then asterisk slash. And so this whole thing is telling Arduino this is all a comment. It starts with this first slash asterisk and ends with the last one. Okay, so when this is in our code, Arduino, when it runs, when the actual microcontroller runs, it ignores everything that's a comment. It's only running actually command lines. Okay, then we have another single comment, and these single comments are just explaining generally what we're going to do with the next line of code. Or we can also have comments at the end of code. And so anytime we want to just describe what's going on, we just use a double slash, and we do not need to end that. So the double slash just says whatever on this line is a comment. So ignore this line when you run it. So what this one's saying is that we're going to look at pin 13 on our Arduino, and we're going to control an LED with that. There's also an LED on the board that is related to pin 13. Okay, so this is pin 13, and we're going to go ahead and give it a name. So what we can do by doing this, saying integer, we're now calling LED equal to the pin location. Okay, and this pin location is actually on our Arduino microcontroller. So the INT just tells the Arduino what type of variable LED is, and it's an integer. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, so forth and so on. Okay, then you'll notice that we end our line with a semicolon. The actual commands that Arduino are going to run, almost all of our lines are going to have a semicolon after them. The exceptions are things, control structures like the loops that we're going to talk about later, and some Boolean operations that we'll talk about in the future. Okay, but for the most part, they'll have semicolons. We now have another comment line, and then we get into the first setup loop. Every Arduino sketch will have two loops. Okay, and the whole idea of a loop is that you'll start the loop, you'll run all your code, okay, and then depending on what type of loop, we may start back up at the top and just continuously run that loop. So there's going to be two loops that are always in an Arduino sketch. The first one is the setup loop, okay, and it needs to be called the special name of setup. And in the setup, what we're doing is just setting up the Arduino for what we need it to do. And so any of our pins, if we need them to be inputs or outputs, all that stuff is going to get set up. And setup runs once. When you turn the Arduino on, or anytime you reset the Arduino, this loop, setup loop, is going to run once. So we call it void setup, open and close parentheses. So this is just telling us that this is a function. Okay, we'll learn about those later. Then we have this little curly bracket. This curly bracket is telling us, okay, this is where the void setup routine or function starts, and then we'll have to end it later. And you notice if you click next to it, it shows us where it ends. Okay, so we have a beginning and an ending. We have a comment line, and then all we have to do in void setup is we're setting, okay, the LED pin, which we've now called 13, for output. Okay, we could have, if we didn't want to name it anything, we could have just typed 13 right in there instead of LED, and that would have been our output pin. So we're telling the Arduino that pin mode, so how's that pin going to behave, is going to be an input or an output. We're telling it that pin 13, which is LED now, is for output, and that means we can actually send a voltage through that pin to turn our LED on. We then close the void setup loop. Once we've done setup, the next routine is going to be one that runs forever as long as the Arduino's on, and it is called void loop. Okay, so we have void loop, open and close parentheses, and then again we start our function. We'll see I click on that curly bracket, we see where it ends down here below. Okay, so what happens is we come into this loop, we tell it it's going to start, then it's going to run all these lines of code. When it hits this closed bracket, it's going to come back up to the beginning and run all these lines of code again. And that's just going to continue forever and ever and ever until we turn our Arduino off or hit the reset button. Okay, so that's what void loop does. So you should always have void setup and void loop. In our void loop, okay, we have 4 lines of code. They're pretty simple. So the first thing we want to do is we want to turn our LED on. So we've told the Arduino where the LED is. It's on pin 13. Now we need to turn it on. The way we send a voltage through a pin is through the digital write command. So we have digital write. So this is now telling us we're going to send a digital signal, okay, which is either a high voltage level or a low voltage level, somewhere between 0 and 5 volts. We're going to send that high voltage, that 5 volts, okay, if it's high. We're going to send close to 0 volts or low voltage if it's low. Okay, so that's our options. It's either on or it's off with digital write. So in digital write, we tell it what pin we're going to send the signal to, in this case LED, which is pin 13, and we set it to high. And that's very specific, HIGH, high. And that sends a voltage signal, the high voltage level, to the LED pin, which is 13. And that is going to turn our LED on. Okay, now we want to wait for 1 second. Because otherwise, right now, if we didn't have this next line of code in, we would just go right to the next thing and we would turn our LED off and you'd never see it. So we need to leave it on for a little bit. Okay, because the Arduino is running each line of code very, very quickly. So now we're saying, all right, Arduino, just wait a second. Okay, and it's exactly a second because we use the delay command. Delay just puts a time lapse in your code, just a delay in your code for however long you want to delay it. And this can be a variable you declared earlier, like LED, or it can just be a number you type in. The number within these parentheses is the delay time in milliseconds. Okay, so 10 to the negative third seconds. So 1,000 milliseconds is 1 second. So we're going to delay 1,000 milliseconds, so 1 second. So we've turned our LED on, we've waited a second. Now we need to turn it off. Same overall command, digital write, so we're doing a digital signal to our LED pin, but the difference is now it's low, which means let's turn it off, put the low 0 voltage to that pin. Okay, so now there's no voltage to our LED and it goes off. Again, we need a delay signal because otherwise we'd come down to the back and we'd come right back up and turn it back on and you'd hardly see it go off if you even did it all. So now we're saying, okay, Arduino, let's wait for another second. So we have the same exact line of code, delay 1,000 milliseconds for 1 second. Notice all 4 of these lines of code end with a semicolon, as they have to. You'll notice that our routines or our functions, the void loop and the void setup, do not have to have semicolons, but the lines of code within them do. Then finally, just the last thing to see, so we hit the end curly bracket, it'll come back up and it's just going to do this over and over and over. Notice we've used comments for each line of code just to tell us what it does. Okay, so double slash, so all of this out here in gray is just telling you as the programmer what your program's doing. Arduino ignores it. Okay, so in our void loop, we've turned it on, We've delayed 1 second. We've turned it off, and then we've delayed 1 second again. Now you're ready to turn it back on, so you just close your void loop. It will come back up, and it'll run that over and over and over. Okay, so that's our first code. Really the basics we want you to pick up are the idea of needing both a void setup and a void loop. Setup runs once, loop runs continuously over and over, and how we start and end those are with these curly brackets. Okay, we've also learned hopefully the digital write command, which is going to send a digital signal, either high voltage or low voltage, to a pin. We've also learned the delay command, which lets us put a pause of a certain number of milliseconds in our code. Okay, the thing in void setup we saw is that anytime we're going to use a pin on our Arduino, we need to tell the Arduino how that pin is going to be used, which in this case we did pin mode LED for output. Okay, we'll do some different things with inputs later in later activities. Okay, hopefully that helps as you move forward.